This is the first of two videos on the development of the northern colonies economy. And when I talk about the northern colonies, I'm talking about the New England colonies, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and I'm talking as well about New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, basically down to the Mason-Dixon line. Uh, in this individual video here, I'm going to talk about very early in the 1600s, and most people were subsistence farmers. That was what the economy was based on, and so I'm going to talk about that subsistence farming economy. But as time passed, we're going to see how the northern economy developed. And you get into the mid-late 1600s, early 1700s, you're seeing more of a manufacturing-based economy, a more commercial, urban-based, capitalist-based economy, and that will follow this video. That'll be the next video, and later on we'll talk about the development of the southern and western economies. But right now I'm going to talk about the early 1600s and the development of, as I say, the subsistence-based economy early on in the north. When you talk about the early subsistence farming in the northern colonies, you got to understand that farming is really challenging. The winters, of course, were longer and the growing season was shorter. In the most northern of the colonies, the New England colonies, the mountains were close to the ocean. At one point, the Piedmont's only 75 miles wide, and all of the north, the soil tends to be rockier. It's not as arable. And to top it off, they're more natural ports. And, all of this discourages agriculture, makes it more difficult, and encourages the growth of towns. You got to realize as well that the early Puritan emphasis on community and the development of their townships also in time helped influence how the northern economies developed, how they developed into more of an urban-centric manufacturing-based economy. But all of that is going to unfold over a period of years, and I want to focus first on the earlier periods when most people were subsistence farmers, and indeed most people remained subsistence farmers well into the colonial period. It may seem like I'm contradicting myself by saying that throughout the 17th century and well into the 18th century, most people in the northern colonies remained farmers. These farmers were subsistence farmers. They had small little homesteads and they grew what they ate, and so they didn't have a staple crop or a crop to sell for cash, and that was what most people did, of course, early in the 1600s. Now, given the environment which I just mentioned, as time passed, the city is going to grow and the number of artisans and merchants is going to explode, and this will in time develop a more diverse and developed economy dominating the northern colonies. But throughout most of the colonial period, most people remained subsistence farmers. So in this video, I'm going to look at how the subsistence farmers lived and type of economy they lived in. And then the next video, as I say, we'll go into more later on how the manufacturing and urban developed. But first, the subsistence farmer. I want to cover in this topic as well just a little bit about these subsistence farmers growing what they need, what they grow. What could you grow up north? Well, corn, I've already mentioned, was absolutely critical. It could be grown anywhere with little tending and partially cleared land and even in sandy soil. It didn't shatter when it was ripened, and so harvesting could wait until after the autumn, wait until autumn until other crops were harvested. It wasn't a rush. It didn't need threshing like wheat, barley, or oats, and it didn't have to be ground up at a watermill. So it was really an advantageous crop. As I've mentioned before, it was the Native Americans who greeted the early colonists that showed them the importance of corn. The early colonists did a number of things with it. The corn could be pounded into cornmeal with a simple mortar and pestle. It could be cooked and, of course, eaten on the cob. The colonists worked really hard, and not surprisingly, they needed a lot of calories. And the early colonists ate a carbohydrate-rich sort of soupy milk and corn mush out of the big bowl at almost every meal. And that just gave them lots of good carbohydrate energy food. Corn mush could be alternated with corn boiled with meat or beans if they had it, or it could be made into corn cakes. Early in the colonial years, people even would make a rough whiskey from corn. That didn't last later on. But you could take roasted or burnt corn and mix it with water and drink it as a substitute for coffee. These products, all these type of products I'm going to talk about here early on the colonies were often bartered and in lieu of money, but they primarily again grew this to eat and survive themselves. The problem with corn was that it had depleted the soil pretty quickly, so they learned pretty fast to sort of mix it with or alternate with other crops that would grow up north, and they tended to grow a variety of vegetables. Many of them, again, they learned from the Indians, but these included things like turnips, pumpkins, and pickles. Way up north in New England, you couldn't grow wheat, but if you're going to talk about the middle colonies, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, you do see some growing of wheat in the southernmost of the northern colony. When the colonists were growing these crops in the 17th century, they often dealt with what's called wheat blast. It was a fungus that kept destroying crops and made agriculture more damaged. You can see a crop here of wheat that was damaged by the wheat blast. The tools that the northern farmers used hadn't changed much in centuries. They had a wooden plow, which could require two people to operate. You have one guiding an oxen and one with the plow itself. Cast iron bits on plows were not introduced until later in the colonial period, not in the early 17th century. Then, of course, they were better at breaking rocks. By the way, when iron bits were first introduced, many farmers still didn't use them, believing that the iron poisoned the soil. For the most poor farmers, and this, of course, is early on as well, they couldn't even afford a plow, and they used a harrow, sort of a gigantic fork, to sort of loosen the soil before they planted their seeds. Crops were usually reaped with a sickle or a longer scythe, and it was perfectly designed because you could swing it across and cut the crops in one bundle. Important to these subsistence farmers in the north were domesticated animals, which included things like horses, cows, sheep, pigs, chickens, ducks, geese, and so forth. Sheep were probably the most valuable for their wool and meat. But the problem was for a lot of these colonists early on that they were very vulnerable to the wolves that were on the edge of the wilderness near the towns. Cattle were first brought to Virginia in 1611 and reached the north in 1624, so very early when a bull arrived at Plymouth Colony. Massachusetts Bay began regular importation of cattle in the 1630s. The cattle tended to be smaller scrub cattle, not like the Texas Longhorns that have been bred today. But, ownership of a larger number of cattle was sort of synonymous with wealth, so you can grow your own wealth. And in the summer months, the farmers would often let their cattle forage in fields or the countryside, but in the long, cold northern winters, they had to keep them in small one-story barns. In the winter, they were fed corn husk and corn stalks and sort of marsh grass hay. Cattle were often undernourished and scrawny until later in the 1600s when farmers introduced a red Dover and rye, which grew rapidly and quickly became the staple of the cattle's diet. Cattle were important because they provided proteins and things like milk, cheese, butter, and meat, and they could also provide hides for leather goods, so they were very important. Pigs were intentionally set into the wild because farmers knew that they flourished there, and they just recapture them later. Sometimes they clipped the pig's ears to signify ownership. As I've mentioned before, however, in time feral pigs multiplied so rapidly they actually became a problem for the farmers raiding their crops on the edge of the frontier. Massachusetts Bay even allowed an open hunting season to keep the feral pig numbers in check. But this concludes the first video on the on the northern economy, talking earlier on the 1600s when most people were subsistence farmers. And as I've said, most people remained subsistence farmers well throughout the colonial period, but as time passed, the economy developed into more urban and manufacturing. And that's what the next video is going to talk about.